Have you ever watched a man discover that his entire life is a lie? In the middle of a field, in the rain, in front of 30 witnesses who will kill to keep the secret buried? That is what happened at Thornfield Cross on the 14th of April, 1887. The Duchess's horse went down first. Not gradually, not the slow stumble of a tired animal, but violently, catastrophically, as though the ground had simply decided to refuse it. One moment Seraphine Alderwick was at full gallop across the south meadow, her gray mare cresting the hill with the kind of effortless power that makes riding feel like flight. The next moment the mare caught her foreleg in a rabbit hole at the worst possible angle, and 300 pounds of horse and woman hit the earth at speed. The field erupted. Grooms scrambled. Huntsmen wheeled their horses. The Duke of Alderwick, riding 40 yards behind, drove his stallion forward so hard the animal's hooves threw divots of wet earth 6 feet into the air. Rain hammered down in gray sheets. Someone was shouting for a doctor. Someone else was shouting for the Duchess. 3 horses were screaming simultaneously, the high, terrible sound that horses make when they smell blood. Nobody noticed the stable boy until he was already there. Vaelor Ashcombe had been working the tree line at the field's eastern edge, holding the spare mounts. He should not have been able to reach her first. By every logic of position and protocol, he should have been last. But he had seen the mare's leg catch before anyone else registered the fall, and he had already been moving before the Duchess hit the ground. And he reached her at a dead run with his coat already off his back before the Duke's stallion had covered half the distance. He dropped to his knees beside her. Her shoulder was dislocated. He could see it from the angle. Her head had struck the ground, but she was conscious. One hand pressed to her temple, breath coming in short, controlled bursts that told him she was fighting the pain rather than surrendering to it. The mare was down and shrieking 10 feet away, and Vaelor made a fast assessment, decided the Duchess was the priority, and pressed his coat beneath her head with one hand while his other found her wrist. "Can you hear me?" he said. "Yes," she said, through her teeth. "My shoulder. I know. Don't move it. Keep still." She looked up at him. Something crossed her face. Not fear, not confusion, but a strange, arrested attention, as though she were looking at something she couldn't yet name. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he turned toward the approaching riders and called out the mare's condition, the Duchess's vitals, and the requirement for a splint, in the clear, organized way of someone whose mind worked faster than the situation around him. The Duke arrived. He threw himself from his horse before it had fully stopped, was on his knees beside his wife in an instant, hands on her face, her name in his mouth, and then his eyes went to the stable boy who had gotten there first, and something in the Duke's expression shifted in a way that nobody who witnessed it could properly describe afterward. Because Vaelor's collar had torn open in the run, and the rain had plastered his shirt to his neck. And there on the left side of his throat, just below the jaw, was a mark the size of a sovereign, wine-dark, shaped like a crescent with a small, distinct break in its upper arc. Duke Octavius Alderwick saw it. He went completely still, not the stillness of confusion, the stillness of a man who has just heard a door open in a room he bricked shut 23 years ago. The Duchess was speaking. The grooms were arriving. Someone was calling for the doctor again. The rain kept falling. All of it continued. The whole ordinary machinery of a hunting accident on a great estate. And the Duke was not part of any of it. He was simply staring at the birthmark on a stable boy's neck with expression of a man watching his entire life collapse from the inside out. Vaelor noticed the Duke had stopped moving. Looked at him. "Your Grace, the Duchess needs." The Duke grabbed his arm. Not gently, not with the authority of a nobleman managing a servant, with the desperate, involuntary grip of a drowning man. "Where did you get that mark?" he said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "That mark on your neck. Where did you get it?" Vaelor stared at him. "I was born with it, Your Grace." For words. And the Duke of Alderwick closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had changed in them permanently. "Get this boy to the lodge," he said quietly, to his head groom. Then, to his steward, even more quietly, "Tell no one what you saw here. No one. Do you understand me?" The steward understood. He had worked for this family for 30 years and knew the specific texture of his master's crises. He had never seen one this color before. And Vaelor Ashcombe, who had spent 23 years being poor and overlooked and forgettable, watched the most powerful nobleman in the county give a quiet order to 6 men, and watched all 6 of those men look at him with the sudden, terrible attention of people who have been told that a thing is valuable and dangerous simultaneously. He did not know what the mark meant. He did not know that in London, at this exact moment, a woman named Lady Elphra Blackthorne was receiving a letter that would make her put down her tea very carefully and begin making calculations. He did not know that by nightfall, the question of his existence would be the most dangerous question in England. He only knew that the Duke's hand was still on his arm, and that the Duke was looking at him as though the world had cracked open between them, and that the rain kept falling, and that the Duchess was watching him from the ground with those arrested, searching eyes. "What's happening?" Vaelor said. Nobody answered him. That was the first time he understood that silence, from powerful people, is never nothing. It is always something they cannot afford to say. Now imagine you are Vaelor. You wake up that morning exactly what you have always been. A stable boy, poor, unremarkable, a young man whose only inheritance is the smell of horses and the ache of work in his hands. By sunset, a duke is guarding you. 30 men are watching you. A woman you have never met has sent riders toward the estate at speed, and no one will tell you why. Would you run? Or would you stay and pull at every thread until the truth came loose? Tell us in the comments. And if this story has already put something in your chest that needs to know what happens next, you're exactly where this story wants you. Subscribe. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. Let's see how far this goes. Vaelor Ashcombe had grown up at the edges of Alderwick Estate the way a tree grows at the edge of a cliff, finding purchase where there was barely any, shaped by a force it had no name for. He had been brought to the estate at age 4 by a woman he was told was his mother and who died of fever before his 5th birthday, leaving him with nothing except a small carved horse she had pressed into his hands on her last lucid morning and a name she had chosen with a deliberateness that nobody around her understood. Vaelor, not a servant's name, not a farm boy's name, a name with Latin roots meaning strength and worth, the kind of name that a woman of education gives a child she believes deserves more than the world is going to give him. The estate took him in because the head groom, a solid Derbyshire man named Croft, had a conscience that was stronger than his common sense. He put Vaelor to work in the stables at age 6, taught him horses the way a craftsman teaches a gifted apprentice, and watched with private astonishment as the boy absorbed everything, not just the practical management of animals, but the subtler knowledge beneath it, the reading of temperament, the understanding of fear, the communication that happened below language between a good horseman and a good horse. By 16, Vaelor was the best rider on the estate. By 18, the best trainer. By 20, there was not a horse on 6,000 acres that would not come to his call. None of this elevated him socially. This was Victorian England, and talent in a servant was an asset, not a credential. Vaelor understood this. He had made a kind of peace with it. Not a contented peace, but the functional peace of a person who has decided that wanting what he cannot have is a waste of energy that could be used for things within reach. He was quiet. He was observant. He had the particular self-containment of someone who learned early that expressing feeling costs you something in rooms where no one is interested in your feelings. He had never, not once, looked at the Duchess. Not in the particular way. Not in the way a man looks at a woman when he means something by it. She was the Duchess. She was as far above him as the clouds above the elm trees. And Vaelor was a practical person who did not confuse himself with fiction. But he had noticed her. He had noticed the way she rode. Not decoratively, as most aristocratic women rode, performing elegance for an audience, but genuinely, with her weight forward and her hands quiet, and her attention entirely on the animal beneath her rather than on how she appeared to the people watching. He had noticed that she spoke to the tenant farmer's children by name, that she had, twice, quietly arranged for the veterinary surgeon to attend animals belonging to families who could not afford the fee, that she sat through the weekly estate reviews with the concentration of a woman who was actually trying to understand what she was hearing rather than waiting for them to end. He had noticed all of this the way you notice a fire on a cold night, acknowledging the heat from a careful distance, not approaching it. The morning of the 14th of April, Vaelor had been assigned to the Sparemount detail for the hunt, 12 horses to manage along the tree line, plus the responsibility of reading the field and anticipating where the main party would need fresh mounts. It was administrative work for a horseman of his ability. He accepted it without complaint. When the Duchess's mare went down, he moved without thinking. That was the thing about Vaelor's nature. In a crisis, the gap between seeing and acting collapsed completely. The Duchess needed help before the Duke could reach her, so Vaelor reached her. It was not heroism. It was arithmetic. He did not think about the protocol breach. He did not think about what it would mean for a stable boy to put his coat beneath the Duchess's head and take her wrist with his bare hand. He thought, shoulder dislocated, head impact, keep her still, prevent shock. He had her stabilized in 45 seconds. And then the Duke arrived, and saw the mark, and everything Vaelor had understood about his own life began to dissolve at the edges. The hunting lodge sat at the western end of the estate's oak wood, a stone-built structure used for mid-hunt rest and wet weather shelter. It had a large hearth, 2 rough chairs, a table, and the permanent smell of wood smoke and horse leather. Vaelor had been inside it perhaps 20 times in his life, always in service, always invisible. Now he sat at the table with a blanket over his shoulders that someone had put there without his noticing, and 6 grooms stood at various positions around the room, with the specific stance of men who are not exactly guards, but are certainly not leaving. And the rain hit the small windows in gusts, and he waited. The Duke came in 40 minutes later. He had sent a rider back to the house with the Duchess. Her shoulder had been set by the estate physician in the field, a brutal, necessary thing that Vaelor had heard from 50 yards and tried not to, and had ridden to the lodge alone, which was itself unusual. The Duke of Alderwick did not go anywhere alone. Protocol, security, and the social performance of aristocratic authority all required witnesses and attendants. Coming alone to a hunting lodge in a rainstorm to speak to a stable boy was the act of a man operating outside his own rules. He came in. The grooms filed out without being told. He closed the door. Then he stood across the table from Vaelor and looked at him in silence for a long moment. In the firelight, Vaelor could study the Duke properly for the first time. He was perhaps 60, broad in the chest, with the kind of face that had been handsome in its youth and was now formidable, defined by authority and the particular weathering of a man who has spent decades making hard decisions. His eyes were gray. They were studying Vaelor with an intensity that belonged to a different kind of situation than this one. "You don't know?" the Duke said. It was not a question. "Know what, Your Grace?" The Duke sat down. He seemed, for the first time, to be carrying his age. Your mother's name, he said. What were you told it was? Vaelor kept his expression still. Mary Ashcombe. She died when I was 4. What did she look like? Dark hair. Small. He paused. She had a way of looking at things as though she was memorizing them, like she knew she wouldn't see them again. Something moved across the Duke's face that was not quite grief and was not quite guilt and was somewhere between both, occupying the territory that the two of them share. She was not your mother, the Duke said. The fire cracked. Rain hit the window. She was your nurse, the Duke continued. She stole you, or was paid to take you. I have never, in 23 years, been entirely certain which. He looked at his hands. Her name was Mary, that much is true. The rest was lies. You were not born to servants. Vaelor, you were not born in poverty. He looked up. That mark on your neck is a hereditary mark that appears in only one family in Britain. It has appeared in every generation of that family for 200 years. It appeared on your grandfather, on your father. A pause that had the weight of a building behind it. On you. Vaelor said nothing. Your father's name was Edmund Blackthorne, the Duke said. He was the eldest son of the Earl of Blackthorne. He died 3 months before you were born. The official account is that he died without issue. The Duke's voice was very even, very controlled. The voice of a man saying something he has rehearsed saying for 23 years and finds no easier for the practice. The official account is a lie. You are Edmund Blackthorne's son. You are the legitimate heir to the Blackthorne earldom. And the woman who currently holds that title, who has held it, built on it, and enriched herself from it for 23 years, is your father's younger sister. The fire, the rain, the smell of horse leather and wood smoke. Lady Elphira Blackthorne, Vaelor said. Yes. She arranged this. I believe so. I have believed so for 23 years. I have never been able to prove it. The Duke met his eyes. Until now. Vaelor sat very still. This was something that people who knew him had noticed, that under extreme pressure, he went still rather than erupting, the way a horse with genuine quality stands motionless in a thunderstorm rather than bolting. The stillness was not passivity. It was concentration. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because I owe you a debt I have been unable to pay. What debt? The Duke was quiet for a moment. I knew your father. Edmund Blackthorne was my closest friend from boyhood. I was with him the night he died. A riding accident, they said, and perhaps it was. Perhaps I have spent 23 years suspecting more than the evidence warrants. But when Mary came to me 3 days after Edmund's death with an infant and a story that she had been his mistress and the child was illegitimate and she needed money to disappear, I gave her money. His jaw was very tight. I was grieving. I was 20 years old. I believed what I was told because the alternative was a catastrophe of such magnitude that a 20-year-old man without sufficient backbone found it easier to accept the simple story. A pause. I have not forgiven myself for that. I do not expect you to forgive me either. Vaelor was quiet for a long time. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. Through the window's small glass panes, the wood was becoming visible again, the oak trees gray and dripping, the path back to the estate a line of dark mud through the wet bracken. You kept watching, Vaelor said. These 23 years. You kept me employed. On your estate. The Duke said nothing. It wasn't Croft who gave me the stables, Vaelor said slowly. It was you. Yes, the Duke said. You were watching over me. Badly, the Duke said. Too carefully and too cautiously, and always one decision short of doing what I should have done years ago. He looked at Vaelor directly. I am trying to do it now. But you need to understand something first. What? The moment I tell you what you are, the moment any of this becomes known, Lady Elphira Blackthorne will move to end it. She has more money than God and more connections than conscience. She has been building her position for 23 years. She is not a woman who will accept the dismantling of everything she has constructed. He paused. She will not attempt to discredit you. Vaelor looked at him. She will attempt to kill you, the Duke said. Just as I believe she killed your father. The fire burned. The oak wood dripped. Somewhere in the distance, a horse called to another horse across the wet fields. Vaelor thought. I have been living on the edge of something without knowing it. All my life, the ground has been thinner than I knew, and I have simply been lucky in my footing, or someone has been quietly reinforcing it. He thought, I am 23 years old, and I have just been handed a life I did not know I had, along with the information that powerful people will kill me for claiming it. He thought, last of all and entirely against his will, the Duchess had looked at him, really looked, in that moment on the ground, as though she was trying to place something. What do I do? He said. The Duke almost smiled. It was a smile with old grief in it. That, he said, is the first question. I'm glad you asked it instead of the others. What are the others? Why didn't you act sooner? Why did you let me grow up in the stables? Whether I hate you. He looked at the fire. I imagine those are coming. They are, Vaelor said. But they can wait. The Duke nodded. And for the first time since entering the lodge, something in his posture shifted, fractionally, almost imperceptibly, as though a small portion of a weight had been redistributed. Then here is what we do, the Duke said. And you must listen carefully, because we will not have much time before she knows. Lady Elphra Blackthorn received the letter at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She was in the music room of Blackthorn Hall, a house of such deliberate magnificence that it resembled a statement rather than a home. She had rebuilt the East Wing in the year following her brother's death, added the orangery in the year following her nephew's disappearance, and refurnished the main hall 3 times since, each renovation a layer of permanence, a further insistence that the house belonged to her now and had always belonged to her, and would continue to belong to her regardless of what any registry of births might theoretically contain. She put down her tea. She read the letter twice. The letter was from her man at Alderwick, not a servant of the Duke's, but her own placement, a man who had been in position for 8 years, who reported on the Duke's household with the quiet regularity of a tide. His letter was brief. It described the hunting accident, the Duchess's injury, the stable boy who had reached her first. It described the Duke's reaction to the stable boy's birthmark. It described the private meeting at the lodge. Elphra set the letter down on the piano keys with a sound that was not a chord. She was 61 years old, tall, silver-haired, possessed of a beauty that had aged into authority and showed no signs of softening into anything else. She had spent her adult life building what she thought of, privately, as a perfect structure. The earldom, the estate, the money, the social position, the London connections, the political friendships. Every element reinforced every other. Remove one, and the rest weakened. Remove the founding assumption. Remove the fact of Edmund's childlessness, and the entire structure fell. She had spent 23 years in the certainty that the founding assumption was secure. That certainty had just changed texture. She went to her desk. She wrote 3 letters, rapidly, in a hand that showed no tremor. One to London, to a man whose name never appeared in polite conversation. One to her solicitor, with specific legal instructions regarding the documentation of her nephew's death. One to her estate manager, with instructions about certain records she wished to have reviewed and, if necessary, amended. Then she sat very still for a moment and permitted herself to think about Vaelor Ashcombe. 23 years old. Stable boy. Unknown to himself. Recently exposed to a duke who had been carrying guilt like a tumor for 2 decades and had apparently, finally, decided to operate. She had time. Not much, but some. The Duke's instinct would be to go slowly, to build legal ground, to approach the revelation with the caution of a man who understood what was at stake socially. He would want documentation. He would want to protect the boy. Before he moved, he would try to do this carefully. Elphra did not need to be careful. She only needed to be faster. She rose from the desk. "Have the carriage ready at 6, she told her butler. "We go to Alderwick." She arrived at the estate the following morning. Seraphine was in the garden when the carriage came up the drive. Her arm was in a sling. The shoulder had been successfully set, but would need 2 weeks of rest. And she was walking the long, herbaceous border with the particular purposefulness of a woman who refuses to be made sedentary by injury. She turned at the sound of the horses and watched Lady Elphra descend from the carriage with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had never in her life made an unplanned visit. They were not friends. They were acquaintances in the precise Victorian sense. They moved in overlapping circles. They were civil. They attended the same events. They knew the relevant details of one another's lives. But Seraphine had always felt, in Elphra's company, a faint and sourceless unease. The way you feel in a room where the furniture is slightly wrong without being able to identify what has been moved. "Lady Elphra," she said, "we weren't expecting you. Forgive the imposition." Elphra's smile was warm and exact, like a fire in a controlled grate. "I heard about your accident, Seraphine. I came as soon as I could. How is the shoulder?" "Healing. Come inside." Inside meant the morning room. Tea, the performance of social comfort. Seraphine managed it with the practiced ease of an aristocratic upbringing, while simultaneously paying attention to things beneath the conversation's surface, which she had always been better at than most people assumed. Elphra asked about the accident. Seraphine described it. Elphra expressed sympathy with complete credibility. Then, with the casualness of someone picking up a dropped handkerchief, "I understand it was one of your stable boys who reached you first. Extraordinary presence of mind for a servant." "It was," Seraphine said carefully. "What's his name?" "Vaelor Ashcombe." "How long has he been at Alderwick?" "Since childhood, I believe." "A local boy?" Seraphine set down her teacup. She did it slowly, giving herself a moment. "I'm not certain of his history. You'd need to speak to Croft about that." She looked at Elphra with an expression that was pleasant and entirely unreadable. "Are you particularly interested in our stables?" The pause was barely a pause at all. "I'm interested in exceptional horsemanship," Elphra said. "We've been looking for a new trainer at Blackthorn. If the boy has real ability." "He has extraordinary ability," Seraphine said. "But I doubt my husband would release him." "Of course." The smile again. "I merely thought I'd ask." She left an hour later with nothing, because the Duke had not been available and Vaelor had, on the Duke's instruction, been quietly moved to the Western tenant farm for the duration of what the Duke was already calling, in private, the situation. But Seraphine sat in the morning room after Elphra's carriage disappeared down the drive and turned the conversation over very carefully, the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath it. And she thought, she came here within 18 hours of the accident, to ask about a stable boy, with a story about needing a trainer that had the texture of something constructed rather than true. She thought, whatever my husband saw in that field, Lady Elphra already knows about it. She thought, I do not know what is happening, but I'm going to find out. She found Croft in the tack room. He was a man of 60, built like one of his own fence posts, with a face that had been tanned the color of old leather by 4 decades of outdoor work. He looked up when Seraphine came in and got to his feet with the respect of long familiarity rather than formal deference. He had known her since she was 18 and had been brought to the estate as a new bride, and had immediately come to the stables to meet the horses before she met the household staff, which had established a rapport that years of normal aristocratic distance had not entirely dismantled. "Vaelor Ashcombe," she said, without preamble. Tell me what you know about him. Croft was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man deciding how much to say. I know what I know, Your Grace. Which is, his mother, the woman I was told was his mother, brought him here in the spring of 1864. Said she was widowed. Said she had no family and no money and needed work. I gave her work in the laundry. She died of fever within the year. He paused. She left the boy. Seemed wrong to turn him out. Did you believe she was his mother? Croft looked at her steadily. His coloring is different from hers. His build. His manner. Mary Ashcombe was, he chose his words. She was frightened, Your Grace. All the time. Of everything. That boy is not frightened of anything. Never has been. Frightened people raise frightened children, in my experience. What did my husband say to you when he transferred Vaelor to the Western farm yesterday? Croft looked at the wall. He said it was for the boy's protection, she said. Didn't he? Croft said nothing. Croft, Seraphine said, not unkindly. I have a dislocated shoulder and a house guest who came here under a pretense and asked specific questions about a stable boy within 18 hours of an accident that frightened my husband badly enough that he couldn't look at me properly last night. I am not asking you to breach the Duke's confidence. I am asking you to tell me what you are permitted to tell me. Croft looked at her for a long moment. Then, I'd ask the Duke, Your Grace. Tonight, I'd make it the kind of asking that doesn't permit silence. Thank you, Seraphine said. She went to find her husband. The Duke was in the estate office. He was not working. He was sitting behind his desk with an untouched glass of brandy and the look of a man who has been sitting in the same position for several hours because getting up would require deciding what to do next. Seraphine came in, closed the door, and sat across from him. She did not ask gently. She loved her husband, genuinely, in the companionate, respectful way of a marriage that had grown from arrangement into something real, and she understood him well enough to know that gentleness, tonight, would be an obstacle. Tell me, she said. All of it. He told her. It took an hour. He told her about Edmund Blackthorne, his boyhood friendship, his nature, his death. He told her about Mary and the infant and the money and the decision he had made at 20 years old that he had been unable to unmake for 2 decades. He told her about recognizing the birthmark. He told her about the lodge and the conversation and what he believed about Elphra. Seraphine listened without interrupting. When he finished, the fire had burned down to coals and the brandy was still untouched. She was here this morning, Seraphine said. He looked up sharply. What? Lady Elphra. She came to ask about Vaelor. She dressed it as concern for my accident and interest in acquiring a trainer. She has a source in this house, Octavius. She knew within hours. His face went the color of old ash. Who? I don't know yet. But she knows. She came to assess the situation. She looked at him steadily. We don't have the time you thought we had. Seraphine. Where is Vaelor now? The Western farm. Holt's place. I told him to stay inside. Use the back. She will find him. Seraphine stood. She will find him before you have built a single legal foundation, and he will disappear the way his father disappeared and the way he himself disappeared as an infant, and 23 more years will go by. Her voice was very even and very clear. He needs to be moved again. Tonight. And someone needs to be with him who isn't a groom. Someone she won't expect. The Duke looked at his wife. No, he said. Yes, she said. I'm the one with the sling. No one will believe I'm doing anything strenuous. I can visit the Western farms legitimately. I do it every quarter, everyone knows it. And Elphra, if she's watching this house, will be watching you. Not me. Seraphine, if she's as dangerous as I believe, then let me be dangerous back. She picked up her riding gloves from the desk. We are not losing this boy twice, Octavius. I will not allow it. He looked at her for a long moment. The coals shifted in the grate. Outside the window, the estate lay dark and vast and silent, and somewhere out in it, in a tenant farmer's back room with no idea what was converging on him, Vaelor Ashcombe was waiting. "Take Henderson," the Duke said. "And a pistol." "I know how to use one," Seraphine said. "I grew up in the north." She found him at the western farm just before midnight. He was awake. She had expected that, had thought, riding through the dark with Henderson 6 yards behind her and her shoulder aching with every jolt of the horse, that he seemed like a man who would not sleep in the middle of something unresolved. She was right. He was sitting on the fence of Holt's South paddock, looking at the dark, and he turned when he heard the horses with the fast, pre-violent alertness of an animal that has recently learned it has predators. Then he saw it was her, and went still. "Your Grace," he said. "You shouldn't be." "I know," she said. "Move. We're going somewhere else." He looked at her for a moment. Then he got off the fence. "Where?" "The ridge cottage above the north wood. Nobody's used it since last harvest. It's off the estate maps. My husband bought it privately 3 years ago and hasn't announced it." She looked at him. "Lady Elphira Blackthorne came to the house this morning asking about you. She has someone inside the estate. You cannot stay anywhere my husband's people know about." He absorbed this with that particular stillness of his. "Then, you believe what the Duke told you?" "Yes. You believe I am who he says I am." She looked at him directly, in the way she had looked at him in the field, from the ground, when he had her wrist in his hand and was telling her to keep still. "I believe you are something that powerful people are frightened of," she said. "That's sufficient for tonight." He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than protocol permitted. "Come on then," he said. The ridge cottage was an hour's ride through the north wood. They did it in near silence, Henderson riding ahead, Seraphine and Vaelor side by side on the narrow track. The wood was silver-black with moonlight, the path beneath them soft with leaf mold, and the horses went quietly in the way horses go when their riders are concentrated and still. At some point, she could not have said when, she became aware that she was monitoring Vaelor's position with the same peripheral attention she gave to terrain, automatically, the way you monitor something that has become important. It irritated her slightly. She did not need the distraction. "Can I ask you something?" he said at one point. "Yes. The Duke has known what I am for 23 years. He gave me work. He kept me close. He watched over me in his way." A pause. "Why didn't he tell me earlier?" Seraphine considered this. "Because telling you earlier meant starting a war earlier. Against a woman with more resources than conscience, who had already demonstrated a willingness to make people disappear." She paused. "I think he was waiting until he had something strong enough to beat her with. The mark alone isn't enough. No. The mark requires corroboration. Birth records, witnesses, physical evidence. He's been looking for it, or waiting for it to find him." She glanced at him sideways. "You asked the practical question rather than the angry one. The angry one won't help me tonight." "No," she said. "It won't." They rode on. "Are you afraid?" she asked after a while. She wasn't certain why she asked. She was not someone who asked personal questions of people she barely knew. Something about riding through a dark forest at midnight in the direction of a conspiracy had apparently altered her social calibration. He considered the question properly, which she appreciated. "No," he said. "I think I would be afraid if I had more to lose. At the moment, what I have to lose is a life that turned out not to be real." He was quiet for a moment. "It's easier to risk a fiction than a fact." She thought about this. That's a remarkable thing to say. Is it? Most people would be angry, or frightened, or overwhelmed. "I'm all of those," he said. "I'm just putting them in order." She looked at the path ahead and said nothing. But she was aware of the quality of his silence beside her, the same quality she had noticed in the field, that concentrated stillness, and she was aware, with the part of her mind that she kept most strictly governed, that she found it extraordinary. She governed that part firmly. For now, the Ridge cottage was small, sound, and entirely unrecorded. Vaelor spent 3 days in it while the Duke moved pieces across the board with the slow, careful determination of a man who knew he had one chance to do this correctly. Henderson brought supplies. The Duchess came on the second day on the pretext of inspecting the North Woods timber, a quarterly task that nobody would question, and brought information. "My husband's contacted a barrister in London," she told him. "A good one. Discreet, experienced in inheritance cases. He's also sent for the parish records from the village where your father grew up." She sat across from him at the cottage's small table. Outside, the morning was clear and cold, the ridge looking north over 5 miles of countryside. "And he's found a witness." Vaelor looked up. A woman named Agnes Trent. She was Edmund Blackthorne's housekeeper. "She's 70 now and lives in Derbyshire." Seraphine's voice was careful. "She was present the night you were born. She says, according to the letter she sent my husband last week, the letter he was waiting for when you fell into our lives, that Edmund acknowledged the pregnancy 3 weeks before his death. She has a written record. Edmund wrote it himself. A private document, witnessed by Agnes and Edmund's valet. Elphira would know about the document," Vaelor said. "My husband thinks she arranged the valet's emigration to Canada 6 months after Edmund died. Agnes Trent, however, she missed. Agnes is not the sort of person Elphira would look at twice. She's a farmer's widow with no social presence and no formal education." Seraphine paused. "Which means she has survived 23 years with that document intact. Can she be reached before Elphira finds out about her?" "My husband sent a rider to Derbyshire yesterday." She looked at him. "But here's the difficulty. Even with Agnes's document, even with the birth records, even with the barrister's brief, Elphira will challenge everything. She has the resources to bury this in litigation for a decade. She'll argue the document is a forgery. She'll argue Agnes is unreliable. She'll argue the birthmark is a coincidence." A pause. "We need something that cannot be argued." "What kind of thing cannot be argued?" Vaelor said. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ridge view, the countryside rolling north, the hedgerows and the winter fields and the small smoke of distant farms. "A living witness of unimpeachable standing," she said. "Someone who knew Edmund, knew about the pregnancy, and who Elphira cannot discredit without destroying herself. Does that person exist?" "My husband believes so." She looked back at him. "There is a man named Lord Carvelston. He's 73, sits in the House of Lords, has a reputation for absolute integrity that has survived 50 years of political life. He was Edmund Blackthorne's godfather. He attended the christening of Edmund's parents, watched Edmund grow up, and, according to my husband, received a letter from Edmund 3 weeks before his death, a letter that described the pregnancy and named the woman carrying the child and expressed Edmund's intention to formally acknowledge the child after its birth. He kept the letter. He kept everything. He is that kind of man." She paused. "He also, according to my husband, has disliked Lady Elphira for the entirety of her adult life. He never believed Edmund's death was an accident. He simply had no evidence." Her eyes met Vaelor's. "Until now." Vaelor was quiet for a long time. "This will destroy her," he said. "If it works." "Yes. The earldom, the estate, the social position. All of it." He looked at the view. "People will be hurt who had nothing to do with it. Servants, tenants, people whose lives are built on the estate." Seraphine looked at him. "Yes," she said. "They will. That is one of the uglier truths about the correction of large injustices." She paused. "It doesn't mean the injustice shouldn't be corrected." He was quiet. "Then no, it doesn't. He looked at her. It means whoever corrects it has a responsibility to those people afterward. She held his gaze. It does. Something passed between them. Not the romance of it. Not yet. But the precursor to it. The recognition of a shared standard. The particular intimacy of two people discovering they use the same moral measuring stick. She left an hour later. He watched her ride back down the ridge toward the tree line, Henderson at her side, her sling white against her dark coat. He thought. She came to a dangerous place in the middle of the night for a man she met yesterday, and she did it as though it were simply the right thing to do, and she did not make anything of it. He thought, I am in a great deal of trouble. He governed the thought firmly. There were more immediate difficulties, but he was aware it was there. On the third day, Elfra moved. She did not come for Vaelor directly. She was too elegant for directness. She went instead to the record office in the nearest market town, with her solicitor and 2 affidavits she had apparently prepared in advance, and attempted to file a legal declaration that the person known as Vaelor Ashcombe was a mentally unstable individual who had been making fraudulent claims regarding his identity, and that any documents or testimonies he produced should be treated as legally suspect pending a formal psychiatric evaluation. The magistrate declined to process the filing. He was a careful man, and the paperwork had irregularities. But the filing existed. It was now a matter of record that Lady Elfra Blackthorne had moved preemptively against Vaelor's credibility before he had made a single formal claim. When the Duke heard about this, he sat very still for a moment. Then he said, to his steward, "She's frightened." "Is that good?" the steward asked. "Frightened people make mistakes," the Duke said. "It's good if we're ready when she makes them. Get Lord Carvelstone's carriage on the road from London today." While the legal architecture was being built around him, Vaelor was spending his days on a ridge above a north wood with nothing to do and a great deal to think about. He was not constitutionally suited to inactivity. He needed his hands working, needed the physical engagement of real labor, needed the animal presence of horses to quiet the part of his mind that had been loud since the Duke's revelation. Without those things, the 3 days at the cottage were 3 days of sitting with everything that had changed and trying to find a stable position inside it. He had grown up poor. He had grown up believing that his worth was a function of his usefulness, and his usefulness was a function of his skill with horses, and his skill with horses was the full extent of his social capital. That architecture had been the foundation of his self-understanding for 23 years. It had not been comfortable, but it had been solid. Now he was being told he was an earl's son, and the solidity was gone, and he was standing on new ground that had not yet finished settling, and he found that the disorientation of it was worse, in some ways, than the poverty had been. What was he, if he was not a stable boy? What had he been, all those years? What had been real? Croft's teaching had been real. The horses had been real. The specific, intimate knowledge of the estate's land, every field, every tree line, every drainage ditch, every tenant family, every struggling farm and well-run farm and farm that needed attention, that had been real. 23 years of watching and learning and understanding 6,000 acres at their ground level, from the perspective of someone whose livelihood depended on the land rather than the land depending on them. That was real. And the Duke had told him, with the compressed, guilty expression of a man delivering a reparation that was also a burden, that the Blackthorne estate was larger. 12,000 acres in 3 counties. Hundreds of tenant families. A village. A river system. Agricultural land that had been managed, since Edmund's death, by a woman who understood politics and social architecture but had no interest in the actual soil. He thought about those 12,000 acres the way he thought about a horse he'd been told about, but never ridden. With attention and a kind of appetite, and the understanding that the gap between hearing about a thing and knowing it was a full life's worth of work. Seraphine came on the fourth morning. She came alone, no Henderson, which told him the situation had shifted in some way. And she came earlier than the previous visits, just after dawn, when the ridge was still in shadow and the north countryside was beginning its slow brightening. He heard her horse on the track and met her at the sea cottage gate. She looked tired. There were shadows beneath her eyes that hadn't been there 2 days before, and her sling had been replaced with a lighter bandage, and she had the focused look of someone who had been running hard on not quite enough sleep. "Lord Carvelston arrives tomorrow," she said, tying her horse to the gatepost. "And Agnes Trent is already here. My husband's man got to her before Elphira. She's at the parsonage in the village, under the vicar's household." "That's good," Vaelor said. "Come inside. There's tea." She looked at him. "You have tea." Henderson brought provisions. "I found a kettle." He held the door. "Come in." She came in. It was the first time she'd been inside the cottage rather than standing at the gate or the paddock fence. He poured tea from a battered kettle and set it on the table, and they sat across from each other in the early morning light, and it was different from the previous visits. Less formal, less transactional. The urgency was still there, but around it, or beneath it, something quieter had room to exist. "How is your shoulder?" he asked. "Better. It's still." She rotated it slightly and winced. "Still catches. You rode an hour each way yesterday." "Yes. With a dislocated shoulder that was set 4 days ago. I am aware of my own shoulder, thank you." "I'm not criticizing," he said. "I'm observing." She looked at him across the table. The light was the particular clean light of very early morning, before the day had established its color. "You do that," she said. "Observe. It's useful. What have you observed?" She sounded genuinely curious, not testing him. He thought about it. That you were someone who was told, growing up, that your primary function was decorative and social, and that you have spent your adult life being quietly furious about it, and that you manage estates and tenant relationships and agricultural decisions with a competence that nobody formally credits, because crediting it would require acknowledging that the decorative function is insufficient. She was very still. "And that it cost you something," he said. "The not being credited. You've made your peace with it, but the peace isn't complete." She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with the steadiness he brought to everything, the same steadiness she had first noticed on the hunting field, when he was kneeling in the mud beside her. "That was accurate," she said, finally. "Uncomfortably so. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm not used to being read correctly." She turned her teacup in her hands. "Most people see the Duchess. They work outward from the title. I work inward from the person," he said. "The title is just the surface." Another stillness. Outside the cottage window, the north countryside was completing its brightening, the fields taking on their colors, the distant tree lines solidifying from gray to brown to green. "What do you see when you work inward from me?" she asked. And then, immediately, as though she hadn't meant to ask it, "You don't have to answer that. I see someone who came to a dangerous place at midnight for a man she didn't know," he said, "and who asked the right questions of the right people with the right precision, and who has a very exact moral compass and a very deep impatience with the world's failure to match it." He paused. "And who is kind in ways that require no audience, which is the kind of kindness that's real." She had gone very still. He had not meant to say all of that. He had meant to stop after the first sentence. Something about the quality of the early morning and the clean light and the two of them on opposite sides of a small table with no one else for a mile in any direction had made the usual discipline insufficient. "I should go," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She went. But at the gate, with her horse untied and the ridge ahead of her and the returning day all around, Vaelor. He had come to the doorway. When this is over, she said. I mean, when the legal matter is resolved, and you are, she stopped. Try it again. The world will be very different for you. On the other side of this. I know. I want, she stopped again. She was someone who chose words with precision, and apparently the right words were not available. I want it to go well for you. It will, he said. Or it won't. But I'll know who I am, either way. She looked at him for a moment. Then she rode down the ridge toward the tree line without looking back. He stood in the doorway and watched her go, and the morning went on brightening around him. And he thought, there is a world in which this ends very badly, and a world in which it ends well, and in both of them the most real thing that has happened to me in 23 years of living is the last 4 days. He went inside. He picked up the carved wooden horse that had been with him since the age of 4. The one thing the woman called Mary Ashcombe had given him. The one continuity between the life he'd known and the one he was apparently about to enter, and turned it in his hands. His real mother had been Edmund's woman, a woman whose name the Duke still did not know, who had either died or been disappeared before she could fight for her son. He carried her in the shape of his hands, in the quality of his stillness, in the name she had chosen for him. Vaelor. Worth and strength. She had known. Lord Carvelston arrived the following afternoon in a carriage so old it had clearly been chosen as a deliberate statement, the kind of equipage that says I am too significant to care about appearances. He was a small man, 73 years old, with white hair and the sharp, entirely undiminished eyes of someone whose intelligence had refused to age with the rest of him. He had not been to Alderwick in 11 years. He had accepted the Duke's summons within 4 hours of receiving it, which was itself a statement. He and the Duke met in the estate office. Seraphine was present. No one else. Carvelston spent the first 15 minutes saying nothing while the Duke laid out everything. The birthmark, the conversation in the lodge, Agnes Trent's testimony, the filing Elphira had attempted, the timeline of the original disappearance. When the Duke finished, Carvelston said, "Where is the boy?" "The Ridge Cottage. Northwood. I want to see him." They brought Vaelor in the following morning. He arrived at the estate's back entrance with Henderson, in plain clothes, while Elphira's watcher at the front gate saw nothing of interest. He was taken to the estate office and left alone with Lord Carvelston for 1 hour. Seraphine waited in the corridor outside with her husband. It was a long hour. When the door opened, Carvelston came out first. He looked at the Duke with the expression of a man who has received the answer to a question he has been asking for 23 years. "The letter Edmund sent me," he said. "I have it. I have had it all this time." He described her, the woman, the mother. He described the birthmark. He described what he intended to do. His voice was very controlled. He described his fears about Elphira. The Duke went still. He suspected her. He suspected someone was going to try to prevent the child from ever being acknowledged. He didn't know who. He wrote it down because he wanted a record, somewhere, in a trusted hand. Carvelston looked at the office door. "He trusted me. And I didn't," he stopped. "I received that letter the week after his death. By the time I could act on it, the infant had disappeared and Mary had disappeared, and Elphira had moved into Blackthorn Hall with a grief so magnificent and a legal process so rapid that challenging it would have required resources and certainty I didn't have." He looked at the Duke directly. "We both failed him." "Yes," the Duke said. "We will not fail the son." Vaelor came out of the office. He looked at Seraphine, and she saw in his face something she hadn't seen there before. Not certainty about the outcome, not triumph, but a specific, solid, completed grief. The grief of someone who has just met their father for the first time through an old man's memories and a 23-year-old letter and understood, all at once, the shape of the life that was stolen. She thought, looking at him, This is the moment after which he is different." She said nothing, but she held his gaze for a moment, steadily, the way you hold something that is very heavy for someone who needs both hands free. He gave her the smallest nod, and then he looked at Carvelston. "You'll testify?" "I'll do considerably more than testify," the old man said. "I'll make the public declaration myself, in the Lords, with the letter and my personal attestation of its provenance. Elphira cannot challenge me without destroying what's left of her reputation." He paused. "She will try, but she will not succeed." "She'll come tonight," Vaelor said. "If she has a watcher in this house, and the watcher saw me come in, she'll know Carvelston's here. She'll know the pieces are assembling. She won't wait." The Duke looked at him. "You think she'll move directly?" "I think frightened people make mistakes," Vaelor said, using the Duke's own phrase back to him without knowing it. "And I think the only move she has left is to prevent Carvelston from making his declaration. Tonight, before he leaves for London." A silence in the corridor. "Then we let her try," Seraphine said. Everyone looked at her. "If she moves against Carvelston," she said, "she hands us the evidence we need that she's done this before. Everything changes from civil inheritance dispute to criminal conspiracy." She looked at her husband. "Let her come, but be ready." She came at 2 in the morning. Not herself. She was too careful for that. She sent 2 men, which was her particular mistake, because 1 man on an unknown property in the dark is manageable, and 2 men on an unknown property in the dark is manageable, and 2 men on an unknown property in the dark become a problem for each other. They came over the east wall and into the walled kitchen garden, which was where Henderson's people were waiting. There was no violence. Henderson was thorough. The 2 men were secured in the granary before 3 o'clock with the specific speed of people who had been given time to prepare. But Elphira, hearing nothing back from her men by 4 o'clock, by the particular quality of silence that told a woman of her intelligence that something had gone wrong, came herself. She came to the front gate, in her own carriage, at 5 o'clock in the morning, with her solicitor beside her and the expression of a woman arriving early for an appointment she had arranged. It was an extraordinary performance. Seraphine, who was watching from the morning room window, felt a grudging admiration for the audacity of it. Elphira asked to see the Duke. She was shown in. She was shown into the estate office, where the Duke was sitting behind his desk with Lord Carvelston to his right, Agnes Trent, a small, white-haired woman with the absolute calm of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 23 years, to his left, and Vaelor standing at the window with his back to the room. Elphira stopped in the doorway. She looked at Carvelston. She looked at Agnes. And then, as Vaelor turned from the window, she looked at him. The expression on her face was not villainy. It was, Seraphine thought, watching from the doorway, where she had positioned herself to see everything, something far more human and far more disturbing than villainy. It was the expression of a woman who had made a terrible calculation 23 years ago and had spent every day since then paying the hidden cost of it, and who had just seen the final bill arrive. "Lady Elphira," the Duke said, "please sit down." She sat. What followed was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. There were no speeches, no declarations of hatred, no operatic accusations. The Duke spoke with the quiet, relentless precision of a man who had been waiting 23 years to be certain before he spoke, and he was now certain, and every sentence he delivered was a document, a name, a date, a corroborating fact that locked the next sentence in place. Carvelston spoke twice, both times briefly, both times in the tone of a man who has no need of volume because the weight of what he is saying is sufficient. Agnes Trent spoke last. She was looking at Vaelor when she spoke. She said, "I held you the night you were born. You had your father's eyes. I have kept the record of your birth for 23 years, and I am giving it to Lord Carvelston now, in this room, in front of witnesses." She took a document from inside her coat. She placed it on the desk. The room was very quiet. Elphra sat in her chair and looked at the document and said nothing for a long time. "What do you want?" she said finally. "Justice," Vaelor said, from the window. His voice was even. "For my father. For myself. For the tenants and farmers of Blackthorn who have spent 23 years under the management of someone who took their estate by theft and murder. You can't prove murder. The two men in the granary will be interviewed by Magistrate Porton this morning," the Duke said. "I expect they will be highly motivated to be truthful." Elphra's solicitor touched her arm. She did not look at him. "The declaration will be made," Carvelston said. "The inheritance will be corrected through the proper legal channels. The criminal matter will be investigated by the appropriate authorities. These are not negotiations." He paused. "You may choose how to spend the time between now and the legal process completing. That is the only choice remaining to you." She stood. She was, even now, even in this room, with everything closing around her, composed in a way that was almost terrible. She had built her entire life on a particular quality of control, and the control had not left her even at the moment of its defeat. She looked at Vaelor. It was a long look. The kind of look that contains 23 years of something she would not name. Then she left. Her solicitor followed. The door closed. The office held its silence. Agnes Trent made a small sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, and was entirely appropriate to the moment. "Is it over?" Vaelor asked. "The worst of it," the Duke said. "The legal process will take time. There will be challenges. But the weight has shifted." He looked at his hands. Then at Vaelor. "I am sorry. For all of it. For 23 years of it." Vaelor looked at him for a long moment. In the early morning light coming through the estate office window, he looked neither like a stable boy nor yet like an earl. He looked like himself, whatever that was, whatever it would become. A man of 23 at the beginning of a very long process of understanding who he is. "I know," he said. "I am not ready to forgive you yet." The Duke nodded. "But I will be," Vaelor said. "Eventually." The Duke closed his eyes briefly. Agnes Trent put her hand over her mouth. Carvelston looked at the window with the expression of a man watching something he has waited a very long time to see. Seraphine, in the doorway, looked at Vaelor. He looked back. The legal process took 11 months. Elphra challenged everything. Her solicitor was skilled and her resources were still vast. The question of asset freezing during the dispute was itself a months-long legal battle, and she deployed every instrument available with the dedication of someone who has nothing left to lose strategically and everything left to lose practically. None of it was sufficient against Carvelston's declaration, Agnes Trent's document, the Blackthorn Parish Register that Vaelor's barrister retrieved from a church in Cumberland, Edmund's own private letter in Carvelston's keeping, and the testimony of the two men from the granary who, exactly as the Duke had predicted, proved highly motivated toward the truth once confronted with the alternative. The criminal investigation moved separately and more slowly. Elphra was ultimately charged not with Edmund's death. The evidence there was circumstantial, aged, and insufficient for prosecution, but with conspiracy in relation to the infant's removal and the falsification of estate records. She was not imprisoned. She was, in the language of the law, of advanced years and diminished circumstances, and the court was lenient in the way that courts in Victorian England were sometimes lenient with titled women. She lost everything else. Blackthorn Hall, the estate, the title, the social position, the London connections, which evaporated with the speed that social positions always evaporate when they are built on the wrong foundation. She went to live with a distant cousin in Scotland, and the county did not see her again. Vaelor became Edmund Rayne Blackthorne, 5th Earl of Blackthorne, by legal declaration in February of 1888. He stood in the registration office in London on a cold morning with the Duke of Alderwick to his right and Lord Carvelston to his left, and felt the name settle onto him the way a new coat settles, foreign at first, then gradually, with wearing, simply his. He spent the first 6 months at Blackthorne Hall not in the main house, but with the tenant farmers, the estate workers, the people whose lives had been running on inadequate management for 2 decades. He walked every acre. He talked to every family. He learned the particular character of 12,000 acres, its problems and its potential, its neglected drainage and its underused pasture and its excellent river system that could have been doing 10 times the agricultural work if anyone had bothered to look at it properly. He did this with the focused, methodical patience of someone who had spent 23 years learning to read land from the ground up, and now had the authority to act on what he read. The tenants, initially cautious, they had learned caution under a landowner who regarded them as instruments, gradually became something else. Word spread. The young Earl worked alongside them, knew their names, their families, their specific difficulties, made decisions that were not the easiest decisions, but were the right ones, and made them without requiring gratitude in return. By the end of the first year, Blackthorne was a different estate. He rode to Alderwick twice during those 11 months. The first time was practical, to thank the Duke formally, in the company of the Duke's household, with the particular ceremony that the occasion required. It was a correct occasion. It was important. It satisfied the social requirement and the genuine emotional debt simultaneously. The second time was less formal. He came on a Saturday in October, when the harvest was in and the estate had the particular exhaled quality of a place that has completed a season's work. He came on horseback, alone, in the early afternoon, and went not to the house, but to the south field, where he knew, from 12 months of paying attention to information about Alderwick, that Seraphine spent her Saturday afternoons. She was there. She was standing on the river bank watching 3 of the tenant farmers work the new drainage channel that had been completed in August, the one she had designed and argued for and finally obtained the funding for after 2 years of quarterly meetings. The work was good. The south field hadn't flooded in the autumn rains for the first time in living memory. She heard his horse and turned. He dismounted. They stood on the river bank in the October afternoon with the harvest light coming low and golden across the completed drainage work in the south field and the river, and for a moment they simply looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have been not looking at each other for 11 months for specific reasons that both of them have understood perfectly. "You could have written," she said. "Yes," he said. "I wanted to come in person." "Proud. Careful," he said. "There's a difference." She almost smiled. "How's the estate?" He told her. He told her about the drainage, the pasture rotation, the river system, the tenants, the particular challenge of the North Farm soil, the unexpected excellence of the Western Woodlands timber, which nobody had assessed properly in 30 years. He talked the way he talked when he was certain of his ground, with the compressed, exact pleasure of someone conveying information they have won through effort. She listened the way she listened, with her full attention and without performing it. When he finished, she said, "You sound like yourself." "I am myself," he said. "More than I've ever been." "That's good," she said. And then, after a pause, "What did you come in person to say?" He looked at the river, then at her. 11 months ago you came to a ridge cottage before dawn for someone you didn't know," he said. "And you told me I was something that powerful people were frightened of, and that was sufficient for the night. And you rode back through a dark forest with a dislocated shoulder, and no one has ever—" He stopped. "Tried again. I have spent 23 years invisible. And you saw me, before you knew what I was. When I was still a stable boy, you looked at me in the field, from the ground, and you actually saw me." She was very still. "I came to say that," he said, "and to say that I am aware of what it means, and what it doesn't mean, and what it can and cannot be, and I am not proposing anything that—" "Vaelor," she said. He stopped. She turned to face him fully, in the late October light, on the bank of the South Field River, with the drained and productive and finally cared-for land all around them. "I am a married woman," she said, "and I take that seriously, and so do you, and I know you are not here to propose anything inappropriate." "No," he said, "but I want you to know," she paused, chose words with the precision she always used when something mattered. "I want you to know that what you just said to me is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time, and I value it entirely, and I am glad you came." He looked at her. The light was doing something specific to her face. Warm, October, the particular gold of the end of things that are also beginnings. "And I want you to know," she said, "that I saw you because there was something to see. That was you. That was always you. It was never the title or the birthmark or the inheritance." She paused. "You were never invisible, Vaelor. You were just surrounded by people who weren't looking." He was very still. She held his gaze steadily, with the directness she had brought to everything since the first moment on the hunting field, that arrested, searching attention that had recognized something it couldn't yet name. "Come inside," she said. "My husband will want to see you, and Mrs. Harrow has been hoping you'd come back since February." He came inside. He returned to Alderwick many times in the years that followed. The Duke lived 8 more years. They were good years, the last few especially, after the guilt had been set down and the debt paid, and the decades of carrying something in silence were finally over. He and Vaelor developed a relationship that was not quite that of a father and son, and was not quite that of two men of different generations, and was precisely what it was, a relationship built of reparation and respect, and the particular affection that grows between people who have survived a complicated thing together. When the Duke died, in the spring of 1896, he left Vaelor a bequest in his will. Not money. A letter. In it, he described every detail he remembered of Edmund Blackthorne, his intelligence, his laugh, his way with horses, his particular and serious kindness. He described the night he and Edmund had ridden out together as young men and had lain in the grass on a summer hill and talked about what they hoped their lives would become. He described Vaelor's mother, whose name, after 20 years of searching, he had finally found. Her name was Clara Wren. She had been a schoolmaster's daughter, educated, clear-eyed, and entirely in love with Edmund. She had died 6 months after Edmund, of a fever that the Duke had never been fully satisfied was natural. She had been 20 years old. Vaelor read the letter in the estate office at Blackthorne, alone, in the early evening. He held it for a long time afterward. Then he put it carefully in the cedar box where he kept the carved wooden horse. 2 lives. 3 deaths, if you counted the stolen childhood. And yet here he was, alive, and settled into himself, and in possession of 12,000 acres of land that he was slowly learning to make as good as it could be. Clara Wren had given him a name meaning worth and strength. He had spent 23 years not knowing why. He knew now. The Duchess of Alderwick, after her husband's death, managed Alderwick Park herself for 3 years before the entail passed to a nephew. She did it, by universal agreement, with formidable competence. The tenants flourished. The estate accounts were the best they had been in a generation. Nobody was surprised. She moved afterward to a small property in the north, a farmhouse, really, with good land, and a river and a view that she had described to nobody, but that happened to be precisely the view she had found most beautiful in all her years of riding the Alderwick countryside. She was 41 years old. On a morning in April, Exactly 7 years after a gray mare had gone down on a hunting field and a stable boy had knelt in the mud and changed the shape of everything, Vaelor Ashcombe, the Earl of Blackthorn, father of 2, executor of 6,000 improved acres, and the slow, ongoing project of making a great estate genuinely good, rode the 12 miles to the northern farmhouse and knocked on the door. She opened it. She was in working clothes, her hair loose, her hands showing the specific combination of mud and ink that was the signature of a person who managed land and kept the accounts herself. She looked at him. He looked at her. 7 years. The world had changed in every relevant way. They had both become, fully, the people they had been becoming since the morning on the hunting field. All the reasons that had required caution were gone. All the obstacles that had required patience had been outlasted. He said, "I'm still working inward from the person." She said, after a moment, "What do you find?" "Everything I found 7 years ago," he said, "and more that I've learned since." She was quiet. "Seraphine," he said, just her name. The way it had always been. The word in his mouth containing more than a word, containing 7 years of deliberate care and genuine respect, and the specific love that grows in people who see each other truly and wait until the seeing is everything that is needed. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. And the morning opened around them. The northern farmhouse, the river, the April fields beginning their slow green return, and he came in. They say in that county that the Blackthorn estate was transformed in a single generation. That where there had been neglect, there was attention. Where there had been fear, there was trust. Where tenants had lived at the edge of subsistence, they lived in modest, genuine security. They say the Earl had a way with the land that was different from the usual way of great landowners, that he seemed to understand it from the inside rather than the outside, the way a man understands a thing he learned before he knew he was learning it. They say his wife had the sharpest mind in 3 counties and the best knowledge of drainage and soil rotation in the north of England, and that the estate accounts under her hand were a model that other estates sent their stewards to study. They do not say much about how it began. The birthmark, the hunting field, the ridge cottage, the dark forest at midnight. Those who knew kept it as people keep things that belong to a particular kind of story, not as gossip, but as something more careful, something true. What they remember is this. On the last night of every harvest, the Earl of Blackthorn and his Countess walked the south boundary of the estate together at dusk, from the river to the far hedgerow and back, which took exactly an hour, which they had never explained to anyone, and which was, by all accounts, a practice they maintained without exception for the rest of their lives. What they were doing, on those walks, nobody asked. But those who saw them return always noticed the same thing. They walked side by side, unhurried, in the particular easy silence of 2 people who have nothing they need to say because they have already said everything, and have the rest of their lives in which to say it again. The harvest stars came up, the fields held their quiet, and the gate closed behind them.